Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to discuss two different kinds of skepticism. Philosophical skepticism and what we might call conspiracy-based skepticism. There's an interesting article by Alex Worsnip, The Skeptic and the Climate Change Skeptic, that contrasts these two approaches to skepticism. So I'll be drawing on his article here. Okay, so first let's start with philosophical skepticism. Probably the most famous kind of philosophical skepticism is skepticism about the external world. A standard argument for external world skepticism appeals to skeptical scenarios, such as the brain in the vat scenario. For all I know, it could be the case that I am a brain in a vat. There are wires attached to my brain, hooked up to a powerful computer that is stimulating my brain in just the right way to give me the sensory experiences of a complete world. So it seems to me that I'm currently sitting in a room recording a YouTube video, but I'm really just a brain in a vat where it's being made to appear that this is what's happening. With this scenario in mind, the skeptic presents the following argument. Premise one: if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know that you have hands. Premise two: you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, so, conclusion, you don't know that you have hands. And of course, this skeptical challenge can be generalized. So, if you don't know that not S, you don't know that P, you don't know that not S, so you don't know that P. Where S is a skeptical scenario and P is any common sense belief about the world. If the skeptical argument is successful, it undermines almost all of our knowledge about the external world. Now, both premises of this argument are pretty plausible, right? Like, in order to know that I have hands, I need to rule out scenarios in which I don't really have hands. I need to have some reason to believe that those scenarios do not obtain. But what reason do I have for thinking that I'm not a brain in a vat? All the evidence I possess, all my experiences, are entirely compatible with my being a brain in a vat. Prima facie, nothing I experience is evidence against my being a brain in a vat. This is the basic challenge of external world skepticism. And before moving on, well, a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon, where I will be uploading bonus videos at least once a week, or with a one-off donation on PayPal. I offer private tutoring. Send me an email if you are interested. I also have a Discord. The link for all this will be in the description. Okay then. So, we've just seen external world skepticism. Now, there are many more local kinds of skepticism, and these are not usually taken to pose any special philosophical challenges. Worsnip focuses in particular on climate change skepticism. The climate skeptic doubts either that climate change is occurring at the rates usually claimed, or doubts that it is caused by human activity. I think the standard view would be, well, there's not really much that is of, philosophical interest in climate change skepticism, or at least it doesn't raise the kind of deep philosophical problems that external world skepticism raises. So, it's not obvious how we should respond to the external world skeptic. External world skepticism raises very deep questions about justification and knowledge. As for the climate skeptic, well, she's just failing to respond properly to the scientific evidence. The debate about climate change is settled at this point. So I guess one way to put it is, if you believe that there indeed is an external world, so if there is an adequate response to external world skepticism, then in that case, the evidence for climate change is just overwhelming. I think that would be the usual attitude among philosophers, right? The external world skeptic raises a genuine challenge. The person, who believes in the external world, who has all of the sort of common sense beliefs, but who is skeptical of climate change, that person is just failing to be rational. Now, I should say at this point, maybe you think that the evidence for climate change is not overwhelming. Maybe you are among the climate skeptics. That's fine for the purposes of this video. Instead of talking about climate skepticism, everything that I'm saying in this video could be framed in terms of some other fringe view that you do reject. Maybe flat earth theory, maybe the moon landing hoax, whatever, right? But just, pick a view that is sort of rejected by the scientific consensus, and then we can sort of consider the skeptic of the consensus in that case. Okay, so we're gonna focus on climate skepticism here, just so we have a specific example to talk about. So Worsnip presents what he calls an idealized climate skeptic. So the idealized climate skeptic has a couple of features. First of all, the idealized climate skeptic is merely a skeptic of climate change. She doesn't assert that climate change is not occurring. She asserts only that we don't know whether or not climate change is occurring. And when I say climate change here, take that to mean anthropogenic global warming specifically, right? Like, so she doesn't assert that that's not happening, just that we don't know. So we can contrast this skeptic who suspends judgment on climate change with the denialist who affirms that such climate change is not occurring. Second, the idealized climate skeptic is aware of the purported evidence among the experts who have studied climate change. She doesn't affirm any straightforwardly false claims about the scientific literature. Rather, the idealized climate skeptic proposes a skeptical scenario, and this is the conspiracy hypothesis. Here's how Worsnip states the hypothesis. So, the conspiracy hypothesis says, there is no anthropogenic climate change, but there is an elaborate scientific conspiracy to suggest that there is, motivated by factors like scientists' political leanings and desire to advance their careers. Some scientists knowingly lie to sustain the conspiracy, while others are more unwitting participants, genuinely convincing themselves of the reality of anthropogenic climate change through wishful thinking, motivated reasoning, selected or biased processing of the evidence, or groupthink. Scientists are consciously and subconsciously disincentivized from uncovering the conspiracy or revealing the truth that it hides, since if they do, they will be denied publications, grants, and jobs. Those who do speak out against the conspiracy are marginalized, forced out of the profession, or hushed up. Now, there are different ways to make this hypothesis more precise. I mean, there are really several different claims being made here, right? Like, some scientists are intentionally lying, some are merely misled due to biases, whatever. There are different mechanisms by which dissent from the consensus about climate change might be suppressed. But the idealized climate skeptic has a scenario along these lines. And the important point is that the conspiracy scenario, if it were true, would explain away the apparent evidence for climate change. It would explain why there appears to be overwhelming evidence for climate change, even though, in fact, there is not. Analogously, a skeptical scenario like the brain in the vat scenario explains away the evidence for the common sense external world. The brain in the vat scenario, if it were true, would explain why it appears as though I have hands, even though I do not. Okay, so we can give the idealized climate skeptic's argument. Premise 1. If you don't know that conspiracy is false, then you don't know that climate change is occurring. Premise 2, you don't know that conspiracy is false, so conclusion, you don't know that climate change is occurring. Exactly analogous to the external world skeptic's argument. And of course we can give a similar conspiracy scenario for various other beliefs that are accepted by the relevant experts. This argument, if it's generalized, is going to undermine a great deal of our knowledge of the world. It's going to, it's not as general as the brain in the vat scenario, right? Like, I can still trust my perception, I can still, I can believe that I have hands, I can believe that I'm using a computer, all of that. But this is going to undermine my ability to trust any knowledge that depends on expert testimony. And so the thought would be this: well, look, these premises are prima facie plausible. The reason for believing in climate change is the scientific evidence, but conspiracy is a scenario which explains that evidence without postulating that climate change is occurring. To know that climate change is occurring, I need to rule out the conspiracy scenario. But it's not obvious how to do this. Conspiracy accommodates the expert consensus on climate change. So, like, if conspiracy were true, we would expect to see the kind of consensus on climate change that we actually see. Expert consensus can be explained by the conspiracy scenario, just as my impression of having two hands can be explained by my being a brain in a vat. Now, I mean, one sort of obvious and initial reaction that we might have to this is to ask, well, why should we believe that conspiracy is true? right? Why should we believe this hypothesis? But notice that the climate skeptic is going to say that she's under no obligation to give positive reasons to believe that conspiracy is true, right? The climate skeptic doesn't need to show that conspiracy is true. All she needs is that we have no way to rule out conspiracy. So if I am just not sure whether or not conspiracy is true, if I suspend judgment about conspiracy, then I should suspend judgment about whether climate change is occurring. And this is exactly analogous to the traditional skeptical argument. The external world skeptic does not need to prove that I am in fact a brain in a vat. The argument works as all that's required for the argument to work is that I don't know whether I'm a brain in a vat, right? So all the argument requires is that I suspend judgment. So we have two skeptical arguments that seem to be analogous, right? If the argument for external world skepticism should be taken seriously, then it looks like the argument for climate skepticism should also be taken seriously. The question then is whether there is some relevant difference between the external world skeptical scenarios, so scenarios like the brain in the vat scenario. Is there some difference between these scenarios and the conspiracy scenario, right? Is there something that would allow us to sort of more easily rule out the conspiracy scenario? So one thought is that the climate skeptic can be disposed of fairly easily because I can evaluate the relevant scientific evidence myself. So I can go and look at the studies, I can go and examine the data, and on this basis I can determine whether the scientific consensus is due to compelling evidence or due to conspiracy or groupthink, right? So I can actually just go and by myself gather evidence about whether or not the conspiracy scenario is true. If I examine the data and it seems compelling to me, then that would suggest that the scientific consensus is based on compelling evidence. By contrast, you can't really do this with the brain in the vat scenario. I can't myself go out and gather evidence for or against it. But it looks like I can do that with the conspiracy scenario. So, in principle, it seems that yes, I could do this, right? So in principle, there is this difference. However, in practice, there are going to be two quite serious problems. The first problem is that I don't have the competence to assess most of the data that's relevant to climate change. I'm not an expert on climate science, and I probably never will be. So I shouldn't trust my own assessments of the data. It would take many years of study to get to a point where I'm actually competent to assess this evidence. So yes, in principle, right, I can go out and assess the evidence myself, but in practice, I just don't actually have the competence to do that. The second problem is perhaps more serious, which is, where does this data come from? Well, it comes from climate scientists. But then, for all I know, that data might have been faked or manipulated. I certainly don't have enough time in my life to run all of the studies and experiments that are taken to support anthropogenic climate change. Right, so the data that I'm assessing is going to be data that is generated by other people. But those are precisely the people that the conspiracy hypothesis says that I can't trust. So this data is itself undermined by the conspiracy hypothesis. So, okay, yes, there is a relevant difference between the external world skeptic and the climate change skeptic here. In principle, there seems to be nothing I can do to prove or disprove whether I'm a brain in a vat, right? If I am a brain in a vat, there's nothing I can do to get out of it. But perhaps there is, in principle, something I can do to prove or disprove the conspiracy hypothesis. That's going to be of relatively little comfort if I can't do those things in practice. And that seems to be where I am, right? In practice, I can't do these things. What I have to do in practice is, rely on evidence that is created and assessed by people that the conspiracy hypothesis says I can't trust. So, it looks like that for both the external world and for climate change, it comes down to trust, right? I must just trust that I'm not a brain in a vat. I must just trust the scientific consensus. And that's not a particularly satisfying place to be. Okay, well, perhaps there are other ways to get evidence against the conspiracy hypothesis. So, rather than rather than try to evaluate the evidence for and against climate change, I might look at how scientific institutions in general work. So, given my understanding of how scientific institutions work, I might conclude that conspiracies among scientists would be rare. Um, so, there are certain features of scientific institutions that present fairly powerful barriers to sort of deceptions. For example, all scientific claims are open to scrutiny by other scientists, and scientists must make clear their experimental methods so that other scientists are able to reproduce their results. All scientific publications go through a process of peer review, right? Where the the experiment, the methodology, the statistical analysis is going to be examined by other experts who are looking for problems with it. Moreover, there are very high costs to fraud in science, right? Like if fraud is detected, you can lose your job. You can completely lose all credibility. And scientists are incentivized to detect fraud because they will gain a lot of credit by falsifying accepted hypotheses. So that's a sort of very brief sketch of a kind of optimistic picture of scientific institutions, right? Like this is how scientific institutions work, and given that they are structured in this way, we would expect that conspiracies among scientists to be rare, and that gives us very good reason to believe that the conspiracy hypothesis is false. So, an obvious problem with this kind of move is that my beliefs about how scientific institutions work are going to be based on testimony from other people, many of whom are themselves scientists, and so these are the very people whose credibility is attacked by the conspiracy hypothesis. After all, if the conspiracy hypothesis were true, obviously we would expect scientific institutions to have the appearance of legitimacy. That's part of what makes a convincing conspiracy. Like, if scientists are deceiving me about the data, they're also likely to be deceiving me about how scientific institutions function. Now, the case here is made harder by two facts. First of all, in practice, when you look at the debate about climate change, there are allegations of conspiracy on both sides. So, the conspiracy scenario that we suggested earlier, that's not merely a skeptical scenario. There are, in fact, people who defend that scenario, who think that scenario is true. So there are climate denialists who will say that this is what's actually going on. But moreover, people who believe that climate change is occurring, the people who trust the scientific consensus, will allege a kind of conspiracy on the part of the climate denialists. So scientists allege that fossil fuel companies, motivated by financial incentives, are engaging in a misinformation campaign to mislead the public as to what the scientific consensus is. So it looks like whether you believe in climate change or not, you probably think that there is some sort of, so there is something like the conspiracy type scenario occurring. We all agree that there are institutions that have enormous financial and technological power that attempt to manipulate the public for nefarious ends, with many of their actions behind a veil of secrecy. And that makes it much more difficult to rule out the climate skeptics' conspiracy hypothesis, right? So we can't say that, conspiracy scenarios are, in general, implausible, because, this kind of thing does happen. The second issue is that there have been many cases of fraud in science. There have been many cases where bias and motivated reasoning have led to faulty results. So I discussed this in a bit more detail in my video, Why Trust Experts, which I'll link in the comments. But just to summarize, so there are studies that have found that something like 2% of scientists admit to outright fabricating data, and up to 1/3 of them admit to questionable research practices. There have been cases of fraud that have continued for years, with the academic institutions protecting the scientists who were implicated in fraud. Science is not free from potentially biasing financial incentives. There are many scientists who receive funding from private industry or who serve at companies related to their research. Science is hierarchical. Agendas may be set by powerful established figures, and challenging conventional views can threaten one's credibility. The point here is that scientists are only human. So, maybe in ideal circumstances, science would be free from conspiracy, right? It would be free from deception. But we know we have seemingly good reason to believe that circumstances are not ideal, or rather, the evidence that circumstances are not ideal seems to be generated from the scientific community itself, and so this is going to sort of lend some. It's going to make it much harder to sort of rule out the conspiracy hypothesis. It's kind of analogous to how, in the case of skepticism of the external world, it would not be remotely plausible to say that, well, perception is perfectly accurate, right? Perception itself often reveals that perception misleads us, right? Like optical illusions and so on. It seems that the results coming out of scientific studies of science suggest that science is very far from ideal. So the fundamental question here is, who do we trust? If I do not initially have any degree of trust in scientific institutions, it's going to be very hard for me to rule out the conspiracy scenario. Like, as soon as I take the conspiracy scenario as a serious possibility, then I'm already open to the idea that there might be scientific institutions that are successfully misleading people. But then obviously, I'm not going to be moved by optimistic claims about how scientific institutions are uniquely immune to conspiracy. These sorts of claims are going to be made by people within those institutions, and I'm not going to trust them. If I don't have that initial trust in those institutions in the first place, then why would I trust any claims from people within those institutions about how those institutions work? Arguably, this doesn't. It's going to be hard to rule out the conspiracy hypothesis on this basis. Okay, another possible reason for taking external world skepticism more seriously than climate skepticism is that there are a variety of different skeptical hypotheses concerning the external world. So, I talked about the brain in the vat hypothesis. That's one of the classic skeptical hypotheses, but there are lots of other ones as well. So there's Descartes' famous evil demon hypothesis. Maybe there is a super powerful godlike being intent on deceiving me, right? So it's not that I'm a brain in a vat. In fact, maybe I'm not a brain at all. I have no idea what, what the sort of substrate of my mind is. But, I'm a mind, and there's this other very powerful mind creating these deceptive appearances. Or there's the dreaming hypothesis. My sensory impressions are just a product of my own mind, as occurs during dreams. And so on. I mean, we can come up with plenty of different skeptical scenarios, and these scenarios are going to invoke different mechanisms of deception. By contrast, it looks like there's only one conspiracy scenario. So there's only one skeptical hypothesis available to the climate skeptic. And maybe that lends greater weight to external world skepticism. Like, the external world skeptic can appeal to a greater variety of skeptical scenarios. All right, 2 points in response to this. First of all, it's not clear why this matters for the purposes of a skeptical argument. So all we need in order to forward the skeptical argument is one alternative hypothesis. So suppose that nobody had ever come up with any other skeptical scenario than the brain in the vat scenario. For some reason, this is the only skeptical scenario that we are capable of conceiving. Well, since the skeptical argument that I gave earlier only uses that scenario, that seems to be enough for the external world skeptic's purposes. the success of the skeptical argument that I gave earlier does not depend on whether we can come up with other skeptical scenarios. One skeptical scenario is all that's required. But second, we might think, actually, there are many different conspiracy scenarios. So I gave, one sort of rather vague conspiracy scenario, but you could elaborate the conspiracy scenario in different ways. So one thing, like for instance, we could appeal more to intentional deception, right? We could allege that scientists are being dishonest, that they're outright lying. Or we could emphasize factors like bias, motivated reasoning, groupthink, right? Like maybe most scientists actually aren't being dishonest. Maybe they're just, maybe they're just sort of misled by these kind of psychological factors. It's not really, in fact, that's not even really a conspiracy scenario. So if we emphasize kind of bias and motivated reasoning more, then we're not really dealing with a conspiracy scenario at all. We're dealing with more like a kind of error, an unintentional error scenario. We could propose that the conspiracy is taking place specifically within scientific institutions. So we could propose that it's just sort of limited to science, and then scientists are kind of misleading everybody else. Or we could propose collusion between various institutions across academia, government, and the media, right? So we could allege a much more global conspiracy. Maybe there's like a cabal of elites unknown to the public that controls the governments and economies of every nation, different forms of government, whether they claim to be democratic or undemocratic, liberal or illiberal, that's merely a sham. Major international events like wars are very carefully controlled, right? So like all of the kind of big events are kind of orchestrated, right? Like we can come up with sort of different degrees of conspiratorial control. We might even come up with rather wilder, with crazier scenarios, So we might say maybe there's extraterrestrial intervention, maybe the cabal of elites are aliens, right? Like you can come up with a whole bunch of different conspiracy scenarios. Some perhaps that might seem more or less plausible with others, but the conspiracy scenario that I stated is sort of vague, but you can see how there's actually like plenty of different ideas here. And so arguably, there are just as many different conspiracy scenarios, or at least there are just as many skeptical scenarios available to the climate skeptic as there are scenarios available to the external world skeptic. Okay, so arguably then, the point of all of this is, it seems, if this is correct, that the conspiracy hypothesis does raise a genuine skeptical challenge. There's no sort of obvious way of ruling out the conspiracy hypothesis, in the same way there isn't any obvious way of ruling out the brain in the vat hypothesis. Indeed, we might well think that the conspiracy hypothesis raises a more serious skeptical challenge than external world skepticism, because climate skepticism is arguably immune to some of the traditional responses to external world skepticism. So let's consider some of this. All right, first of all, it's often alleged that external world skepticism is in one way or another self-defeating. So Susanna Renard, for instance, she's argued in her paper Reasoning One's Way Out of Skepticism that external world skepticism leads to skepticism about the past, right? So she argues that the same arguments that are used to establish skepticism of the external world are going to be used to establish skepticism of memory, skepticism of the past. But then skepticism about the past leads to skepticism about complex reasoning. But if we're skeptical of complex reasoning, we're not going to be able to endorse any of the arguments that led us to skepticism in the first place. So in that way, external world skepticism ends up being self-undermining. Now, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. I won't go into that here. But it's just worth pointing out. It doesn't seem like climate skepticism, at least the sort of idealized climate skepticism that was stated earlier, doesn't seem like that's going to be self-defeating in this kind of way. I mean, idealized climate skepticism doesn't appear to lead to any contradictions. It doesn't appear to, like the sort of argument that is used to arrive at idealized climate skepticism doesn't seem to undermine itself. So self-defeat just doesn't seem to be an issue here. A second popular response to external world skepticism is the Morean shift. I have a video on Morean responses to skepticism. I'll link that in the comments. The Morean argument claims that there are certain common sense propositions that are more plausible than any philosophical propositions used in an argument against those common sense propositions. So the proposition, I know that I have hands, is more plausible than any philosophical theory. I mean, no proposition could be more plausible than the proposition that I know I have hands, right? Like that's as that's as sort of firm and as plausible as any proposition could be. So in response to any skeptical argument that concludes that I do not know I have hands, it's perfectly legitimate for me to sort of reverse the argument, right? So the skeptic says, if I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. But the Morean says, well, right, no, right? Like, actually, you should just affirm, I do know I have hands, so therefore at least one of the premises of the skeptical argument is false. Because the proposition, I know I have hands, that's more plausible than either of the two premises in that skeptical argument. So, rather than use those two premises to arrive at the conclusion that you don't know you have hands, you should start with the claim that you do know you have hands, and then you can derive that at least one of those skeptical premises is false. So that's the Morean shift. Similarly, some philosophers say that there are certain propositions that have a sort of default justification. There are certain propositions that we are entitled to believe without further evidence. Some propositions are required in order for any kind of inquiry to get started. They are assumptions or presuppositions of inquiry, and therefore they cannot rationally be challenged in the course of inquiry. Common sense claims about the external world, such as that I have hands, maybe they have this sort of status. So they're just immune from skeptical attack. So, okay, it seems clear that this kind of argument is not going to have any force at all against the climate skeptic. So really, I mean, what these sorts of arguments are doing, whether it's, Morean arguments or arguments that appeal to this, idea of the presuppositions of inquiry, like, we're trying to find, certain propositions that, are kind of held, without doubt, right? Like, there's no reasonable way of doubting them. But the thing is that the claim that scientific institutions are trustworthy, the claim that conspiracy is not true, that's not a piece of just obvious common sense. I could easily give up the belief in the trustworthiness of scientific institutions without it making a huge difference to my life. I could easily give up this belief without, giving up this belief would not render me unable to engage in intellectual inquiry or whatever. Like, it would not prevent me from engaging in practical activities in my life. One obvious indication of this is that there are very large numbers of ordinary people who have, in fact, given up this belief. There are many people who do think that scientific institutions are untrustworthy, that the expert consensus on climate change is due to a great conspiracy. There are ordinary people who believe this, and these are people who've had no exposure to philosophical argument. So it really doesn't seem like the proposition scientific institutions are trustworthy, that really does not seem to be a kind of piece of common sense in the way that I have two hands is a piece of common sense. And so in that respect, this traditional response to external world skepticism is just totally powerless against the climate skeptic. Okay, a third popular response to external world skepticism is inference to the best explanation. So even if two hypotheses are both consistent with the evidence, one of them might be much more credible than the other because it might provide a better explanation. For example, other things being equal, we prefer simpler hypotheses. Occam's razor tells us not to multiply types of entities or causes beyond necessity. If two hypotheses are compatible with the same evidence, but one is simpler than the other, we should believe the simpler hypothesis. Now, this appeal to theoretical virtues is a common move in response to external world skepticism. So we should believe the common sense hypothesis over the brain in the vat hypothesis because the common sense hypothesis is simpler in various relevant respects. So Alex Worsnip suggests that this same move might work against the climate skeptic. So he says, quote, "The hypothesis that anthropogenic climate change is really occurring is simpler than the hypothesis that there's an elaborate scientific plot to make it seem like it's occurring." Okay, so, I mean, let's grant, for the sake of argument, that simplicity does indeed tell against the brain in the vat hypothesis. There are some problems with this sort of move in the case of climate skepticism. We're considering two hypotheses, right? So we have on the one hand the trustworthiness hypothesis, which says that scientific institutions are mostly trustworthy, anthropogenic climate change is occurring, and then we have the conspiracy hypothesis. There is a scientific conspiracy to make it seem as if anthropogenic climate change is occurring. Now, prima facie, the conspiracy hypothesis does not invoke any new or unusual types of entities or causes. It proposes that scientists are dishonest or biased or whatever, but we already know that people often are dishonest and biased. The conspiracy hypothesis proposes that there are scientific institutions spreading misinformation and engaging in cover-ups, but we already know that there are institutions that spread misinformation and engage in secrecy and cover-ups. So the conspiracy hypothesis postulates actions of the sort that we know people perform. And indeed, as we've noted, those who accept the trustworthiness hypothesis with respect to scientists will themselves allege dishonesty and bias with respect to other institutions, in particular those who doubt the scientific consensus on climate change. There are different ways of defining what simplicity is. But if we take this idea of Occam's razor, right, do not multiply types of entities or causes beyond necessity. I mean, it doesn't look like the conspiracy hypothesis is proposing any, new types of entities or causes. It's appealing to the sorts of behaviors that we already know that people perform. By contrast, the brain in the vat hypothesis, well, that does postulate a new type of entity. It postulates a supercomputer of incredible power that's capable of simulating an entire world. Compared to that, the conspiracy hypothesis is utterly mundane. Simplicity doesn't really seem to help. It doesn't seem to help in the case of climate skepticism, or at least it's not as obvious that it helps in the case of climate skepticism as in the case of external world skepticism. So, along similar lines, with respect to inference to the best explanation, Worsnip suggests that the problem with skeptical hypotheses is that they are ad hoc. So for any evidence that seems to indicate that I'm not a brain in a vat, the external world skeptic will just build it into the story about the vat. The vat operates in just the right way to cause that apparent evidence. Similarly, for any evidence that seems to indicate that anthropogenic climate change is occurring, the climate skeptic just builds it into her conspiracy hypothesis that this evidence has been generated by the conspiracy. So both skeptical hypotheses are rendered unfalsifiable by continually making ad hoc adjustments to the hypothesis so as to accommodate the potentially refuting evidence. And Worsnip suggests that this reduces the credibility of a hypothesis. So again, yes, right, the trustworthiness hypothesis and the conspiracy hypothesis may well be equally accommodate the evidence. They may be equally consistent with the evidence, but because the conspiracy hypothesis is just so ad hoc, it's made all of these ad hoc adjustments, that makes it a worse explanation. Unfortunately, it's not clear that these skeptical hypotheses are ad hoc in the relevant kind of way. So, in some sense they're ad hoc, because they were explicitly constructed as alternative hypotheses to accommodate the evidence, right? So they make no new predictions. But it's not clear that the hypotheses need to be adjusted in response to apparently disconfirming evidence. I mean, take first of all the brain in the vat. Suppose I come to believe that I am a brain in a vat. Is there anything I could experience, even in principle, that would come as a surprise to me? Well, it's hard to see how, because any experiences can be generated by the vat. Once I accept that initial brain in the vat hypothesis, there's no need to make any more ad hoc adjustments, no matter what I experience. And the same seems to be true for the conspiracy hypothesis. If I come to accept this hypothesis, I will not be at all surprised when I see, for instance, new studies that claim evidence for climate change. I will not be at all surprised by descriptions of scientific institutions that make them seem trustworthy. Now, I think in the case of the conspiracy hypothesis, as we've stated it, there might well be falsifying evidence, because what if the scientific consensus changes, right? What if scientists start producing evidence that anthropogenic climate change is not occurring? Well, that would seem to undermine the idea that they're engaging in a conspiracy to mislead people and make people think that climate change is occurring, right? But of course, I mean, we only need to begin with a slightly more general conspiracy scenario. So instead of saying that scientific institutions are like specifically misleading people with respect to climate change, you'd say something like this. Scientific institutions are untrustworthy. There are regularly conspiracies to mislead the public about the facts for political or financial reasons. There is no guarantee that these institutions will promote exactly the same theories indefinitely. In different circumstances, they might deceive the public in different ways. I mean, you're not necessarily going to tell the same lie all the time in all circumstances. So if I accept this hypothesis, I'm not going to need to make any ad hoc adjustments to it, regardless of which way the scientific consensus goes. This hypothesis does not postulate that the scientific community promotes some specific theory for some specific reason, merely that there is this sort of general deception going on. Arguably then, the traditional responses, or at least some of the traditional responses to external world skepticism, even if they're successful against the external world skeptic, seem to be powerless against the idealized climate skeptic. Okay, a final point. So I've framed this as a skeptical challenge to scientific institutions because I assume that most of my viewers tend to trust scientific institutions. But really, this is a skeptical challenge to trusting any group of experts, whoever you think the experts are. So maybe you don't take scientists seriously. Maybe you're more inclined to trust Joe Rogan and Alex Jones and Andrew Tate. That's fine. Obviously, we can construct a conspiracy scenario involving these people as well, right? Whichever the relevant group is, whoever it is that you think is telling the truth, you can construct a conspiracy hypothesis, and then that will allow you to state a skeptical argument, which will undermine, which will claim that actually you don't know that what they're saying is true. Okay then. That's that for this video. That's all I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye, everybody.